Good evening and welcome to everyone who is present here at the CIC and those tuning in through our YouTube live stream for tonight's presentation with Dr. Jennifer Bryson on this wonderful book, The Church in the Flesh, of which she is the German to English translator. My name is Angelica Tom. I am the Director of Programming here at the CIC, and it's a pleasure having you, and I hope you will join us again for the many events that we have coming up. But I am pleased to introduce Dr. Bryson, who is, indeed, the translator of The Church in the Flesh, and this is the first time it's been translated from into English, so thank you, as I don't speak German, which was published by Clooney Media in 2023. She is also transcribing and translating a number of essays and has several forthcoming books by the same author. Friederike Görres? No.
Got it.
Ida Görres, let's say that.
Yes.
Dr. Bryson is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and previously worked for the U.S. military and several other think tanks. She earned her BA at Stanford and master's and PhD at Yale. She's a convert to Catholicism, so yay. And also, this is fascinating, a hobby puppeteer and founder of Flying Fox Puppets, really, in her home base of Lincoln, Nebraska. It's an amateur puppet theater that does some wonderful work. So why is this particular little German Catholic book important? This little book from the 1950s, not quite so little. Well, she's about to tell us. Dr. Bryson, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ida Friederike Görres. This is a name very few Americans have heard of, and even fewer would be courageous enough to try to pronounce. This does not bode well for marketing books. So why would I suddenly spend several years of my life translating the works of this author into English that have not yet been translated? It's because I think she is a voice that we need in the Catholic Church today, and she's a voice who has something very rich to offer. To give you some idea of the milieu from which she comes and in which she's categorized, I'd like to share from you a quote by the German theologian Manfred Hauke, who in 1993 published a critical study of feminist theology. And in this, he comments, "There are highly cultured women in the 20th century who, from a Catholic perspective, have made outstanding contributions. The writers Gertrude von Lefort, Sigrid Undset, and Ida Friederike Görres, the philosopher Edith Stein, the catechist Oda Schneider, and the theologian Barbara Albrecht, and many others. Feminist theology is blind to testimonies like these," end quote. When Ida Görres died in 1971, she was just the kind of voice that the 1960s revolutionaries who were rising into power within the German church wanted to sweep under the carpet. We don't do that old fuddy-duddy stuff anymore. And she was then subsequently largely forgotten. But now there's a renewed interest in her work. And I'd like to share with you today about her life, focusing in particular on her work, and pause when we get to 1950 to tell you in a little bit more detail about the Church in the Flesh. She was born in 1901 in a small village in Bohemia, where the family estate of the von Coudenhove-Kalergi family was. Her father was of noble descent. He had been a Habsburg Empire diplomat, and while he was stationed in Tokyo, he married a young woman who was the daughter of an antiques dealer, and they had two sons in Japan. And then in the late 1800s, he moved with his young Japanese bride to this village in Bohemia. Ida Görres was one of 7 children. Her father died when she was very young, and her mother somewhat rejected the 3 daughters in the family and even told them they were ugly because they had shared Asian and European features. So Ida Görres had a difficult childhood, And in this context, I think she was raised in large part by nannies. And this is significant for when we talk about her works and her life later, because one of her nannies was from England. And Ida Görres had, by the time she was in her 20s, a remarkably very strong command of English. And throughout her whole life, she had a tremendous love for the English people, English literature, and English history, including in particular St. John Henry Newman. So we'll get to him. In 1920, when she was 19, she had already published her first book, which was a play. And leading up to that, she had done her initial education in Bohemia, but then she attended Catholic girls' boarding schools at convents in Austria, first in Vienna, then in St. Pölten. In St. Pölten, the school was run by the Mary Ward sisters. And this is where Ida Görres encountered love. She experienced being loved by the sisters. She experienced the Catholic faith alive. And while she was there as a teenager, although she had been baptized and raised Catholic, she had a conversion experience that set the trajectory of the rest of her life in a new direction. And as I mentioned, she was already gifted at a very young age in writing and published quite early on. In the 1920s, she spent a year and a half in the novitiate with the Mary Ward sisters in St. Pölten, discerned, however, that this was not her vocation, and she felt called to engage as a Catholic in the world. In the 1920s, she was deeply involved in the amazing Catholic revival that I think is too little known that went on in German-speaking Europe at the time. And she was particularly involved in the Catholic youth movement with Romano Guardini and others. In the Catholic youth movement, she was a leader of ministry for girls and women, and she published regularly and also assisted in editing in some of the most prominent Catholic youth movement journals. By the 1930s, she was publishing her own books. And the first book she published, The Nature of Sanctity, was picked up right away and translated into English to be published by Sheed & Ward. And in addition to being published alone, it was published as part of an anthology edited by Christopher Dawson and T.F. Burns. And this is one of the few works by Ida Görres that is still available in print today in English. And it's available from Clooney Media. And a tip for you, if you look for it at the Clooney website, you need to search under her maiden name, Coudenhove. And the Dawson anthology will show up. Also, this first book is going to give us an indication of what's to come in several ways. That it is about the nature of sanctity. The saints and sanctity then will be at the center of Görres's work for the rest of her life. And this really becomes her main specialty in and she's most known today and valued for her contributions to the renewal of modern hagiography, as well as pioneering some innovations in how hagiography is done, including an incorporation of psychology, but in a sense that is viewed as highly credible, not the craziest of crazy modern psychology. Her next publications, again in the early 1930s, she publishes another dialogue called The Burden of Belief, where where two young people are discussing Catholic belief, and a theme of the book is that belief in the modern era for Catholics is going to be difficult. She has a very keen eye for the problems of modernity that are beginning to take over, and that being a Catholic in this environment is going to become more and more difficult. Next, she publishes a set of quote-unquote letters. And I have my fingers up in air quotes for letters, because this is another genre that's common in her writing and that we're going to see in The Church in the Flesh. These aren't letters that she had written to someone and then she republished in a book. Instead, she's writing chapters of the book in the form of letters to individuals who are likely sort of composites of those with whom she actually corresponded and with whom she was engaged in her various apostolates to work with girls and women. And this book, The Cloister and the World, is on vocations for women, with letters to young women, one who is called to be a nun, another who's called to marriage, and another who thinks she might be called to be a nun, but just goes through discerning that's not going to be the path for her. And that book also has a wonderful essay on St. Joan of Arc, one that is republished by Frank Sheed in the 1940s in a book called Saints Are Not Sad. And Clooney Media has Saints Are Not Sad for sale. And again, you'll find that essay by searching under Coudenhove, not Görres. In the 1930s, she also published A Life of Mary Ward. Again, it's translated into English, and she wrote some other books on saints. A major turning point in her life in 1935, after she had spent some time as a consecrated virgin, is that at Easter 1935 in Leipzig, she marries Karl Joseph Görres. And this is a surprise for her. Culturally in Germany at that point, she's born in 1901. By 1935, she's marrying somewhat late, but this is a great joy for her. However, in their marriage, they experience infertility, which she describes as the greatest pain in her life. And her writings on this pain are really gut-wrenching. And it's through this that Ida Görres is featured in Volume 2 of the series, The Theology of Home. Volume 2, the theme of the book is that part of womanhood is living fruitfully instead of seeking power. And the book has many wonderful profiles, as it should, of mothers with children. But the authors, Carrie Gress and Noelle Mering, told me when I first met Carrie that they wanted to include one woman who was single and never married. Let's just say you'll recognize her if you read the book. And they wanted to include a woman who had married, suffered infertility while being open to life, and had had to find other ways in life to live fruitfully. And I told Carrie about Ida Görres, and so instead of going out and finding another woman living today, they have a little section in the book on Ida Görres. And for her, the main avenues for fruitfulness in her life are first being a wife. She writes about that as her first vocation, and also her life as a Catholic writer. Next, we get to the Nazi era. During this time, there's still a lot we don't know about her life, but there's some things we do know. And I would describe part of her life at this point as what is called by some authors the interior immigration that other writers went through, of having to withdraw internally when they couldn't publish. But she didn't entirely do that. She was very alarmed by the new Nazi image of woman and womanhood that was being pushed, and she considered this particularly dangerous. And so she published in the 1930s two, and then early 1940s, one more, anthologies of short stories for girls and young women. And the short stories are by a variety of authors, and some of them are by her. And it was a tremendously creative way, so creative that it got past the censors, to present to young girls what she felt were wholesome images of womanhood that countered the Nazi ideological concept of womanhood being pushed on girls mandatorily in the girls' groups that they were required to be part of, the Bund, sort of like scouting groups, but it was mandatory, so it really had a great influence. She also published a book on Saint Radegund during this period, and also in the early 1940s, a dialogue on mercy. And this dialogue on mercy, on carrying another person's burden, is a counter to the rise of totalitarian states, especially the Nazis, although she's also aware of the communist states, about the tremendous importance of humans exercising mercy with other humans rather than the government taking over all social functions. And she became quite ill in the early 1940s, but she was always a workhorse, always writing. And we know that during this time, she was working very hard on her masterpiece, her book on Saint Therese of Lisieux, that was published in 1944. However, the first print run was almost entirely destroyed in a bombing in Freiburg. Imagine being an author. There's many things you can't publish during the time. War's been going on for years and years. You finally get this big book out on Saint Therese, and it's bombed. But enough copies of the manuscript survived that she was able to republish it in 1946. And to this day, this book is considered her masterpiece. It was translated into English in 1959 and is carried sometimes here at the CIC bookstore. It's called The Hidden Face, published by Ignatius Press. And Father Benedict Rochelle called it not only what he thought was the best biography of Saint Therese of Lisieux, he felt it was one of the finest hagiographical works written. After World War II, in 1946, we see a burst of productivity from Ida Görres. We know today, although they didn't know this at the time, that in 1946 she finished writing, after giving also some public lectures, a book on the life of St. John Henry Newman. She never published it during her lifetime. A stack of papers were found in the 1990s and given to a Newman scholar in German. Then he died. And then the collection of papers went to another great German scholar, Hanna Barbara Gell-Falkowitz, who has really single-handedly over recent decades kept the light on so that people could learn about Ida Görres. And she edited the book and published it. I've translated it into English, and that's the next one that will be coming out from Ignatius Press. In 1946, she published what's known as a letter on the church, an essay that stirred up wildly more controversy than she ever could have expected. An issue's too complicated to go into today, but I need to put it out there on the radar screen. She continues to publish some things on the church. She begins publishing poetry, and in 1949, again publishes a collection of short stories for girls and young women. But there's really just a collection of short stories for adults. And this is called The Bride of Alexius. And the short story, The Bride of Alexius, is one of my favorites of her works. So I'll want to get that out in English someday. And in 1949, she publishes an absolutely beautiful little book on marriage and on being single. And it's 4 letters, 3 of them from her to young women and 1 of them from a young woman to her. And the interns of mine who have read my English translation keep emailing me from time to time, Jennifer, when can we tell our friends about this book and have them buy it? It's coming, and if in your kindness you would ask Saint Ivo, the patron saint of lawyers, for his intercession, that we would find a way to work through copyright issues. I think the readers, when that comes out someday, would appreciate it. And now we get to 1950, when she publishes The Church in the Flesh. This is a continuation of the work she did in 1946, 47 on trying to write about the church. During the Catholic youth movement, Romano Guardini wrote a famous essay called The Awakening of the Church in Souls. And Ida Görres is concerned, yes, that's exciting and wonderful. She had lived through that revival. But what she thinks she's starting to watch happen is the dying of the church in souls. And she's very concerned about those who have been raised Catholic but are increasingly detached from the church. She's aware that the young generation has just come through World War II and is very poorly catechized. She's aware that modernist ideologies and philosophies are now unleashed after World War II and gunning to take over Europe. And so what she does in this book is she wants to try to explain what the Catholic Church is and what the Catholic faith is. But what's distinctive about this book is it's not just providing information about the Catholic Church and information about the Catholic faith. Instead, she's engaged in a very personal, intimate discussion in 6 letters again, with individuals, 4 of them with the way the book is framed, who are Catholic, but are increasingly thinking like, yeah, but we need all this old-fashioned fuddy-duddy stuff, and I'd like to be accepted by my peers and look cool and modern, so maybe we can just get rid of some of this traditional Catholic stuff. And she's trying to help them see through these letters that there's a coherent whole that needs to come along together. There are 6 letters in the book. The first 3 are to a young woman named Barbara. A little inside information for you that's not in the book is that Hanna Barbara Gell-Falkowitz has told me that Barbara is actually her niece. That Ida Görres, and I know that Ida Görres' brothers were very much, they were liberals in the sense of 19th century anti-Catholic liberalism. And they were generally, especially very anti-Catholic. She has some kind of funny stories from her childhood, and this trend continues throughout her whole life. And so this niece is the daughter of one of those brothers who seems to have inherited more from the brothers than she has from the Catholic Church. And so chapter 1 is about the stuff that Catholics have, the church in the flesh, the things that we can touch, rosaries, scapulars, etc. And Barbara is wondering, look, I believe in God. I know human beings have a soul, but do we really need all these knickknacks, all of this stuff? She's basically asking what we would say today, isn't it enough just to be spiritual without religious? And Ida Görres in the first chapter walks her through slowly to help her see why the material things of the church are part of the manifestation of the church. Chapter 2, she writes to Barbara about how the Catholic Church has a historical nature and how we cannot remove the church from her roots. The church is like a tree, and even though we can't see the underground roots, if you cut off the roots, the tree dies. The next chapter is about why we believe. And then we get to the 4th chapter. The 4th chapter is addressed simply to Dear Madam Doctor, appears to be written to a medical doctor. And as you'll hear from this short passage I'd like to read you. There's 3 characters in this scene. The medical doctor she's writing to, a woman who has visited the home, who was a missionary doctor, and Ida Görres. Chapter 4 is titled The Nuisance of Morality. Dear Madam Doctor, I cannot get part of our conversation yesterday evening out of my head. You know what I mean, don't you? Our dear visitor, the woman who is a missionary doctor, said that a historic religious crisis of great consequence is looming in Africa. The native tribes are no longer satisfied with the traditional primitive religions, which no longer correspond to the actual living conditions. So they stand indecisively before the double offer of Christianity and Islam as missionary creeds that are promoting themselves. Our interlocutor said that Islam would have a better chance because it tolerates polygamy, while with baptism, the Christian missionary demands monogamy, and there you intervened with passion. This, once again, seemed similar to today's church, and here she's bringing out the voice of Madam Doctor she's writing to. This once again seemed similar to today's church, jeopardizing the entire future of Christianity in a large part of the world because of a truly insignificant point of sexual morality. Isn't it more important to proclaim Christ and his kingdom than monogamous marriage? This may sound somewhat familiar. And while reading this book, I thought, wow, she could have written this today. And in that chapter, she goes on to explain why faith and morality form part of an integral whole. And you can't have one without the other, and you can't ditch challenging moral points just to think, well, it would make us more popular. Chapter 5 is written to a recent convert named Johanna. And Johanna is a little uncomfortable with the pomp and grandeur in the Catholic Church. And she's kind of wondering, isn't it maybe like a bit much? Shouldn't we tone it down? And Ida Görres points out to Johanna that Johanna has come from a Protestant background and seems to have a lot of assumptions that Jesus was really just a nice guy who helped the poor and was basically a social worker. Well, this chapter is titled The Enthroned, and it is a tour through Catholic doctrine as well as a great deal of the Bible about Christ as King, not in the sense of recent controversies and dust-ups on social media in America, but in a much deeper sense in the Catholic faith. And with chapter 6, the last chapter, we get to a crescendo of the whole book. And chapter 6 is titled, and this won't surprise us at this point, the Church of Saints. And chapter 6 is about the nature of sanctity. And in this, she guides us and shows us how it is the saints who reveal the answer to the question, what does it mean to be a human being? And no spoilers, I'm not going to give that away. You'll have to read the book to find out. In addition, I also want to mention on chapter 6 on the saints, a friend of mine, Kent Hill, read the book, and he wrote to me that he had enjoyed the whole thing, but he said chapter 6 was really made it worth the price of admission. And a Dominican priest who reviewed the book for the European Conservative also highlighted how he felt chapter 6 was really the richest part of the book. In addition, I added to the English translation a register of biblical references. It's about 4 pages long in the book. I think it's a fascinating part of Ida Görres' life, how much she loved the Bible and is always weaving it into her works here and there. And I also hired a professional indexer. So the book has an index. So you can find, for example, the many references to, among others, St. John Henry Newman in the book through the index. And lastly, I created a discussion guide for the Church in the Flesh and had the wonderful fortune of being able to test this out and adjust it with 2 different online book groups who have been wonderful to meet with. One member of the group is here today. And that guide is suitable for book clubs and also perhaps for classroom use, perhaps advanced high school, more likely university and various adult education programs. Now, this has brought us up to 1950. And in closing, I'd like to give a quick overview of the remaining 21 years of her life and her works. In the 1950s, Ida Görres went through many long periods of illness and was bedridden for several years at a time. This seems to have been perhaps partially due to something she had inherited genetically. Both she and one of her sisters had muscle spasms of some sort from time to time, but also those who know the life of Ida Görres well feel that this long period of illness was also likely a reaction to the severe difficulties she had been to in 1946 with the controversy about the essay she had written called A Letter on the Church. But she kept working, and she is able, in a way that I admire greatly, to use her illness as a time to reflect on what it means to live with suffering. And so this is one of the themes one finds in her journals from the 1950s. She published her journals from the 1950s, and this was translated into English under the title Broken Lights. Unfortunately, though, it's out of print, but at least it's available and perhaps it can be brought back. She also published a book on the saints, as well as a number of essays. In the early 1960s, she published a short book that was translated into English under the title Is Celibacy Outdated? It has a defense of priestly celibacy. That essay, I really like the name of it, The Sons of the Resurrection. And the book also has reflections on healthy ways to conceive friendship between women and priests. And she also, in the early 1960s, wrote an essay against the ordination of women to the priesthood. This was something she had experienced activists pushing for since the 1920s. And that essay got translated, is the only work of hers I know that was translated into English not once but twice. And it was translated right away because this was such a hot topic. It was translated in the UK and the US. And I found in a report by the American bishops in the 1970s on the question of the ordination of women to the priesthood, a document that concludes no. One of the sources they cite is this essay by Ida Görres. She also wrote an essay on her growing concerns about the directions the liturgical reform movement was taking, and I've translated that essay under the title of the book it appeared in, Does Modern Man Have a Capacity for Liturgy? And that is available online at 1 Peter 5. In 1970 and 71, the last 2 years of her life, she publishes first a book called Bread Grows in Winter. And this is an anthology of essays and lectures of hers from the late 60s up to 1970. And this has an essay of hers, for example, from 1969 with the startling title, Demolition Troops in the Church, that she published the week before the Novus Ordo was promulgated. And it is about her additional further concerns about what is happening, not only with liturgical reform, but also she doesn't use the word iconoclasm, but she's describing a time of destruction and iconoclasm in the church. And this book has an essay that is tremendously relevant today, that I think is important for those who may have fear and concerns in the Catholic Church. You know, what on earth is going on? How do we still believe? How can things be changing this much and still be Catholic? In 1970, she gave a lecture to alarmed, concerned, frightened German Catholics who, I think even more than we can imagine today, were experiencing, the sky falling on them. You know, revolution was underway. Everything they had grown up with was being torn apart and tossed out the window. And she titles this lecture, Trusting the Church. I translated that. It's available in an academic publication, but it will be republished by Ignatius Press in my translation of Bread Grows in Winter. And the version of it in the book that's coming out from Ignatius Press has additional footnotes to help the reader understand some of the references in the lecture. So I'd say wait for the Ignatius Press edition. 8 days before her death, she issues her final salvo in print. And she sends to the publisher a book that is a defense of the indissolubility of marriage. It's a very unpopular view in 1971. And it's a fascinating, very different approach to explaining that, quote, what binds marriage forever, unquote, which is the title of the book. So I have published that, and am trying to work with a wonderful publisher, I can't say yet because there isn't a contract, through copyright hurdles, but that should hopefully be coming. In May 1971, Ida Görres was a delegate to the Synod of Würzburg in Germany. The Synod of Würzburg in Germany was very much a preparatory stage and forerunner of the synodal way we see in Germany today. And she was giving a very impassioned speech at the synod, and then she collapsed, was rushed to the hospital, and the next day died of a brain hemorrhage. Several days later, at her Requiem Mass, the priest who gave the homily was somebody she had become friends, a priest she had become friends with and admired greatly, who was at that time known by the name Father Joseph Ratzinger. And thus we find here and there, later on in the works of Father Ratzinger and then Cardinal Ratzinger and then Pope Benedict XVI, references to the work of Ida Friederike Görres. And in his homily at her Requiem Mass, the text of hers that he quotes repeatedly throughout that homily is this 1970 lecture, Trusting the Church. With that, I would like to draw this to a close, but since this is a book by Ida Görres and not by me, I feel we can take a little more liberty. And I would like to ask, before we take questions, if there's anybody, Angelica, can you take online questions?
Yes.
Okay, if there's any...
They can type it in the chat box.
Okay, if there's anybody who's watching online or anybody who's here who's read anything by her, who would want to share any comments about what readers might find if they pick up a book by Ida Görres. And if we don't get any, also we can head right into questions, and I welcome your questions. And there is a microphone that Angelica has so that the viewers online
Yes, so
will be able
just
to...
raise your hand if you have a question about Dr. Bryson or Ida Görres. I'm just curious to know, how did you become fluent in German, by the way? Like this passion?
By chance. As a teenager, I wanted to be an exchange student, and I had studied French in high school. I was a child. I heard that the French didn't like Americans, so I said, well, I don't want to go there. I liked mountains, so on my list of choices, I put French-speaking Switzerland first, and the parents of my brother's girlfriend had been in Europe some, so I went to ask them, and they said the Austrians are very nice, and Austria is pretty. So I put Austria. I really wanted to go to Finland because I'm part Finnish, but I thought it would be best if I learned a language that was maybe a little more broadly useful than Finnish. So anyways, I got sent to Austria through the exchange student program, and fortunately got good advice to study the language before you go. You don't learn a language just by osmosis in a foreign country. So I began studying German and went to Austria for my junior year of high school. And then I spent my sophomore year of college in the former East Germany at the Karl Marx University as a 19-year-old who was a bit naive and adventuresome, and continued to work on my German there.
My goodness. And when did you personally encounter Ida Görres in your lifetime?
2019.
2019.
Yeah.
So not that long ago.
No.
Wow. Other questions? One moment.
Wonderful talk. So many questions. Seems like she should be better. I mean, she seems like a real, guide to the navigating the modern church. As a lawyer, I'm curious about the copyright issues. I know her mother was a convert. Was she a serious Catholic? Did she imparted that to Ida? Anyway, you want to talk about the copyright or?
Well, first I want to mention her as a guide in the modern world. I think for that she's amazing, and I think the reason her works are so relevant today is this combination that she's deeply rooted in the church throughout the centuries. She loved church history and is always drawing on it here and there, and she has such, as I said, such this keen awareness of these developments that are happening in the 20s and 30s already, that Catholics are going to be in a world that's going to be hostile, more and more hostile. Also, because she was so often involved in apostolate ministry work that was of a very personal nature. For example, in the 1930s, she worked for several years. I think it was around 1932 to 35 for the Diocese of Meissen, Dresden. And she was in charge of ministry to girls and women. And so, and she had also done that during the youth movement. And so she's also constantly talking with young people. And then later on, she carries on a lot of correspondence, and people are going to her for questions. She also did a lot of convert education throughout her life, personally, individual preparation of people for confirmation. So she's super well read, and she's got her finger on the pulse of these problems that are emerging and how they're going to need to be addressed. And about her mother. Her mother at the time had to convert to marry her father. Her mother, however, never learned German very, very well. And she remained Catholic to the end of her life, but was not super involved in the church. However, a little note about this: in Mödling, Austria, which is where her mother lived in the last years of her life. And it's near Heiligenkreuz, where I've been living for the past 2.5 years. The City Museum of Mödling has a cabinet with some items from Ida Görres's mother, because she was quite a famous woman. For a Japanese woman to marry a nobleman and be in Europe in 1898 is quite extraordinary. And at the City Museum outdoors, they have a little Zen garden dedicated to her. But she was Catholic. But in modern Austria, it's cooler and more exciting to have a Zen garden. Copyright.
All of her works will be in the public domain in 2041.
Oh, 2041 is on my radar. The year 2041, whether I'm living or dead, there will be a very large smile on my face. So with some of her work, such as The Church in the Flesh and Bread Grows in Winter, the copyright is owned are owned by a publisher in Switzerland. And then also the John Henry Newman book was published after she died. And so that copyright's owned by a publisher. It's one reason that I've translated those, because I can get those out. With the other ones, let's talk at the reception afterwards.
Fair enough.
Jennifer, you had talked about her being quite ill for extended periods of time, and you suggested two possible contributors to that. One was a genetic possibility, but the other was a reaction to something that she had written. Could you talk a bit more about that?
In 1946, a new journal that was established after the war received a letter by a Protestant, an essay by a Lutheran Protestant that was very critical of what was going on in the pastorate in the Lutheran Church. And the editors of the journal thought, instead of publishing it alone, that they also should solicit a Catholic view of what's going on among Catholics today. And they went to Görres. She was already very well known to them at this time, and asked her if she would write the Catholic counterpart, which she did. The Lutheran pulled out, and Görres was left standing, and most of the readers didn't read or pay attention to the introduction that explains this context. And also, this is a period in Germany in which the Catholic Church has been squashed and had many constant difficult decisions to make, has had many martyrs during World War II, and is trying to reestablish itself as an authority in German culture and even as an influence on German politics. And so the leadership of the church is very sensitive to establishing its credibility at this time. Also, you've got an emerging movement from the left that wants to expand the role for laity and even get rid of the priesthood. And so the leadership in the church and the priests are also very sensitive to this and nervous about it. The letter on the church that she writes, when you read it today, and you'll be able to read it in 2025, 2026. I've edited a volume of 19 essays she wrote about the Catholic Church from 1941 to 1971, and this is in there. So when you read it, everybody who reads it, and a Swiss theologian who was a friend of Görres, who wrote an essay about her in the 1970s, he said, those who read it today wonder what the big deal was. And when you read it today, where every 60 seconds on Twitter, there's 10,000, or X, there's 10,000 posts that are exponentially more brutal than this document was, you wonder, wait, how is this that controversial? But this context where there's so much sensitivity and where there's not a tradition of speaking openly about problems in the church, where she is sharing her concerns that people are hungry for the Holy Mass, and yet sometimes it's celebrated in a sloppy way. By the way, I just want to note there, she's not saying that people want to get rid of the Mass and have something modern. The hunger she's finding is people want something that's holy when they're away from day-to-day life going to Mass. She talks about how sad and disturbing it is that there are priests for whom the priesthood is kind of a career, and they actually seem more interested in kind of pursuing their hobbies, but they just do the priesthood thing to the extent they have to, rather than understanding the holy nature of their office. She has a passage in this that talks about, and it sounds like she's writing from first-person experience maybe. She's saying to her audience, look, when there is a young woman who's in a crisis pregnancy, and you're trying to help her, and you telephone 16 different convents, and it's not until the 17th one where they say, yes, we'll take her, after 16 have said, well, that's not in our budget for this year, I don't know if we can. She said, there's something wrong in the church. And so it's issues like that she's writing about, and it was just viewed as, I guess, too much too soon. And the other thing is, a number of the very harsh responses she got sound quite clear in their responses, like they never read it. They're writing to her about what they heard about it. And indeed, in a letter, in an essay that's either 1962 or 63, I'm trying to find the original German edition of it, by then Father Ratzinger, the essay is on obedience in the church, and he opens the essay by mentioning this woman who created basically a new literary genre in the church of criticism of the church. And that was a letter on the church by Ida Görres in 1946. But we find out there, and also in a later comment, decades later, in an interview, I think it's in one of the interviews with Peter Sewald, where he says, well, I didn't read it, but I knew what was in it. So she just hits a sensitive nerve, and she's a bit naive and doesn't understand that this sensitivity is there. So it really is just an intersection of two things. Also, the journal she published it in, Frankfurter Hefte, becomes very much identified as a journal of the left. And it's interesting that she publishes almost nothing in that journal after that. And by the early 1960s, the milieu that's coming from that journal begins to realize that Ida Görres is sort of their enemy, that she's not one of them. But the leadership of the church, that's so sensitive and worried at the time, associates her with being part of that group. So it was just a big, huge, explosive controversy.
We have time for one more question.
All right, I just got it.
Go ahead. Yeah, but before you do, a quick note.
He can't ask a question.
But I can answer.
No, I'm sorry.
About that letter on the church in 1946. She received hundreds of responses, over 700. And this was at a time when there was a paper shortage in Germany. And a volume that was published in German that's an anthology of some of them has 109 out of over 700. And that volume is 600 pages long. And she wrote that overall the responses she got that were personal one-on-one letters, many of them were from priests, were, I don't remember the percentage, but something like 70 to 80% positive. So there was a different response among Catholics on the ground from the public hierarchy that banned her from speaking publicly for example, in the diocese of Munich-Freising, etc.
I was joking that you didn't want her to let me ask a question, not him. We know each other. So.
Yeah. Oh, no, what's going to come? We'll see.
You may not want to talk about this, but she did write an essay on liturgy in 1966. And so I was just wondering, because you have sort of given a tour of the whole spectrum of everything she wrote about, what did she did she have a sort of a perspective on Vatican II and these sorts of things, or is this just too much to talk about now?
Well, I can't comment on that essay, since that essay, is coming in the middle of the 1960s, before sort of all the documents of Vatican II are coming out and being known, and it's really more on what's going on in the liturgical reform movement. It has been going on for a while, but it's really exploding in the 1960s. And one of the questions in the liturgical reform movement is, does modern man have a capacity for liturgy? And there's this idea that modern man in an industrialized world is so different from human beings as they have been on the planet forever, that they couldn't even handle liturgy, so maybe we need something completely new. And Ida Görres, so a book is published on that, and they asked, I don't remember, about 35 major theologians and writers, almost all Catholics, to respond to that question. And she's one of the prominent people that's selected to respond. She responds to that by saying, this is the wrong question. The question is, when does man have a capacity for liturgy? And she she insists on that framing because she points out that, for example, in East Germany, where they don't have all these changes going on from the Reform movement, they really have the old, very traditional liturgy, and it is a fully industrialized society. She has these beautiful accounts of what the liturgy means to Catholics under the communist society, and a quote from a blue-collar worker who's not able to go to Mass for months at a time and is able to go at Easter, and says a person can live up for a year on this. So she says that's the wrong framing. As for when man has a capacity for liturgy, she then goes through 8 different topics, such as, and one of them is when man views Holy Scripture as the Word of God. And then she has then an 8 counterparts to these that are man does not have a capacity for liturgy when. And one of them is when academics have worked hard to try to convince people that these are, just stories that aren't really relevant anymore. And then a number of others.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Bryson.
Thank you.